Pinned down in a valley of fire, the SEALs whispered their last words. The machine gun on the ridge cut the earth into dust and blood. Lord, save us! The cry tore through the radio as hope collapsed. Then from the rocks, a single shot split the silence. One enemy dropped, then another. The battlefield froze. A hidden sniper had revealed herself, not a radio girl, but a legacy reborn. Her breathing was calm, her hands steady, as if chaos itself obeyed her aim. Every squeeze of the trigger was deliberate, precise, impossible to escape. Her bullet carried not just survival, but justice buried for decades. Who was she, and why had she stayed hidden until that moment? This is VeteranBiker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. Heat rippled off the rocks until the valley itself seemed to breathe. Sand scraped in the wind like a whispering blade. The platoon had taken cover in a shallow cut that offered the illusion of safety and nothing else, helmets pressed to shale, knuckles white around rifles that had already grown hot from use. The first burst of machine gun fire had been wild, probing. The second carved the lip of the wash into gravel and drove everyone lower. Radio traffic stacked on radio traffic, voices stepping on each other, breathless, clipped, one word at a time. Contact North Ridge, fixed, pinned. She lay between two slabs of sun-bleached limestone with a radio tucked under her chin, listening to men measure their chances in syllables. They called her the girl with the handset, the one who relayed, repeated, recorded, the one who knew every frequency and none of the answers. Radio girl, report. Radio girl, confirm grid. Radio girl, acknowledge. She did, every time, because acknowledgements were easy, and options were not. On the ridgeline to the north, a PKM chattered, coughed, chattered again, and a man to her left flinched as chips of stone stung his cheek. 200 meters up the draw, somewhere in the shale ledges crowning the valley, glass flashed and vanished. The platoon sergeant hissed for smoke. Someone threw a canister too close. White bloom drifted back over the wash and fogged their own sight lines. The machine gunner laughed, or the wind made a sound like laughter. It didn't matter which. She keyed the push to talk. Sierra Actual, this is Sierra 2-5. Machine gun, North Ridge, somewhere between the Twin Cedars and the Split Boulder. Possible spotter higher up. We're exposed. Copy 2-5. Hold tight. Air support is 9 minutes out. 9 minutes on paper was a lifetime under a gun that didn't miss twice. The medic crawled past her to a man whose boot heel bled through the fabric. The squad leader looked at her once. The way men look when they have memorized every angle and still come up short. Any good news on that net, Olivia? He asked dry. He said her name with the reflex of habit, but the tone of someone who had labeled her beforehand. Negative, she said. Winds are pushing down valley. They have the high ground and the mirage. He grunted. No kidding. A high, thin crack split the air and the rock behind her spat dust. She didn't think. She grabbed the spare case that nobody had opened and slid the zipper with her thumb. The foam cradle inside held a precision rifle in matte finish, bolt slick with oil, scope capped, action clean. It was the kind of insurance no one expected to need until they were already filling out the claim. She had inventoried it 2 days ago because she inventoried everything. She had also, hours earlier, watched the plume drifting along the ridge and listened to the sound the valley made when wind bounced off hot stone. She knew what direction did to a bullet and what distance did to confidence. The squad leader saw the case and scoffed. Great. Toys? You plan on calling their mother while you're at it? I plan on giving you your 9 minutes, she said, and her voice surprised even her with how flat it sounded. He blinked, then shook his head. We're not trained for long gun. You're not Trained, she finished for him, snapping the scope caps off. The reticle lit when she settled behind it. She rolled to a knee and checked wind with the old-fashioned way. Dust pinched between fingers, tossed and watched. The grains hung and slid left. Not much. Enough. A bullet struck the wash and kicked sand into her teeth. She tasted salt and grit and the metallic echo of adrenaline. The radio coughed in her ear. "Air is 8 minutes out, Sierra. Hold position." She pressed her chest lower into the rock, made herself a thinner idea, and slid forward until the ridge filled her scope. The PKM nest was a bruise of shadow tucked under an overhang, dark on dark, betrayed only by the flex of the belt and the exhaust ghost wavering in heat. She tracked left. There, a sliver of glass behind a curl of thornbush. The spotter. He had set up higher, just enough to watch the wash and correct. He was better than the rest. He would need to be first. Her breath slammed in her ears until it didn't. The world thin-sliced itself into lines and angles, planes and numbers. At 10, her grandfather had made her balance a dime on a fence post and hit it with a slingshot from across the pasture. At 12, he had stood her in the river and asked her to count the seconds between gusts by the way leaves glittered. At 13, he had handed her an old, honest rifle and said, "Not many shots, only the ones that matter." She blinked, and the valley shrank to a circle of glass. 2-5, status. The platoon sergeant strained. "Stand by," she said, and for once she meant it. She set the elevation, dialed a hair for drift, and settled the reticle on a nothing, on the idea of a man behind glass. The trigger broke like an exhale. The report kicked into her shoulder, traveled through bone and memory, and was gone. Half a heartbeat later, the thornbush twitched, then sagged. The glint vanished. She rode the recoil back to target and held. The machine gun stuttered. She slid the bolt, felt the smooth brass go out and a fresh round go in, then dragged the sight down the ledge to the overhang's shadow. The PKM chewed rock and rage. She could not see the gunner's face, only the geometry of a posture, the angle of elbows, the rhythm of sway that happens when men think they are untouchable. The reticle kissed the belt box, the pivot, the soft space where machines depend on men. She pressed and the belt bucked. The chatter hiccuped, flailed, stopped. "Jesus," someone breathed. It might have been her. To her right, a young scout who had been quiet all day dared to lift his head 2 inches above the rubble. "Who's shooting?" he asked, eyes wide, like he'd never seen a thing die in silence. Olivia didn't answer. The wash felt larger. Space returned to its own size. She racked the bolt again and went hunting for the one who would take the next shot against them, because there is always a next, and it is usually a man who believes he is smarter than the last. Movement flickered near a notch of limestone that poured heat like a kiln. A head, a shoulder, the suggestion of a rifle sliding into the open. She corrected, breathed, let her finger forget it was a finger and think it was something lighter, thinner, inevitable. The stone near his cheek coughed dust as her bullet arrived, and he folded out of frame the way paper folds, soft, unwilling, surprised. 2-5, the net crackled. Identify the firing element. We're hearing single shots north ridge. She keyed her mic without lifting from the glass. Sierra actual, I've got eyes, she said, and the valley seemed to hold that sentence between 2 fingers to examine it. She tasted the shape of what it meant as she spoke it out loud. Not permission, not request, a report and a promise. "Copy," the voice said. "Different now." "Copy, maintain." The wash exhaled as one organism. Men shifted, shoulders loosened, muzzles moved. Calculus updated itself. For the first time in a long minute, the sound of their own hearts didn't drown out everything else. On the ridge, a runner broke from cover, sprinting toward where the machine gun had died. He wasn't carrying a weapon, he was carrying ammunition. She tracked, held ahead, let the heat shimmer lie to her, and then lied back in the other direction. When the reticle touched the space he would occupy 2 seconds later, she fired. He tumbled forward onto his own momentum. The box slid from his hands and rattled down the slope. "Whoever's got that long gun, keep them off that nest," the platoon sergeant barked, the same voice from minutes earlier, but the grit had purpose, not panic. "I hear you," she said quietly, more to the rifle than to the net. The stock was warm. The metal smelled like oil and summer. She counted breaths and not seconds. On the far side of the ridge, a second glass glinted. Copycat, or the original spotter's replacement. He had watched what she did and believed he could be faster, or luckier. He lacked the patience to be either. He took a snapshot at the wash, wide, panicked, and the round hit 20 meters short, a puff in the dust. He wasn't settled yet. She waited, let him think he had time to gather himself, and when his rifle finally looked steady, she took his steadiness away. Silence isn't quiet on a battlefield. Its absence shaped like a question. The absence that followed that shot was large enough to climb into. "All stations," the radio said. "Lower, calmer now. Air will be 5 mics. Prepare to mark. Copy 5, she said. She swallowed, and a pebble of dust clicked against her teeth. The squad leader slid beside her, sweat cutting tracks through the sand on his face. He didn't look at the rifle. He looked at her. "You want to tell me when you learned to do that?" he asked. "Long before I learned to say copy," she said, and a corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, not exactly. It was something that remembered how, even here, he peered over the rock again. "You keep them honest for another 5 and I'll owe you a coffee. Hell, a box of them." "Just keep everyone breathing," she said. "Coffee's useless without breath." Another figure crept along the ridge, low, deliberate. This one had studied something. He moved in 2-step beats, froze in the shade, moved again. She liked him immediately, because worthy targets tell the truth about you. He slid behind a stack of flat stones and slowly raised a piece of broken mirror to sight the wash by reflection. Clever. Reflection meant reversal, meant everything was backward and right became left. If she aimed at what she saw, she would be wrong by enough to pay for it in blood. She blinked grit from her eye and pulled the scope off him. Scanned a half-meter to the right of where instinct told her to look, then another half. The top edge of his rifle gave him away, a sliver of barrel black as wet ink against white rock. She didn't take the shot, not yet. She watched his rhythm, counted it off in the slow drumbeat of her own chest. 2 steps, freeze, breathe, 2 steps. She cut in between beats and squeezed. The barrel sliver vanished. The mirror clattered as if a hand had relaxed. She waited for a hand to reach for it again, and it did not. "No more fire from North Ridge," someone reported, voice reluctant with hope. "Confirm no movement near the nest," came the reply. "Negative movement," she said, and the words felt like a door closing, the right door, the one that left everyone on this side still talking. A single mortar round whistled, distant, then farther. The crew that had the tube had decided today wasn't their day, not with eyes staring back at them from a scope they could not locate. The wash breathed deeper. Men who had been flat enough to be paper grew 3-dimensional again. The medic tied off a bandage and patted a boot. Someone laughed once, a bark, then bit it back as if joy might draw fire. Dust on the horizon smudged itself into the sleek lines of inbound support. The net filled with vectored call-outs and clipped confirmations that sounded cleaner than any prayer. She eased her finger off the trigger, finally, and let the rifle sit quiet against her. Her cheek had molded to the stock. When she lifted it free, the imprint lingered like a memory. 2-5, the air controller said. "Mark position." A hand near her flung orange smoke high where the wind would carry it up the wash instead of down into their faces. The plume unfurled and climbed. The jets answered. The ridge where the PKM had chewed the world into panic a few minutes earlier erupted into stone dust and void. Rocks tumbled like dry thunder. The valley reset itself to a new map. In the aftermath, quiet didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like a thing earned. The squad leader tapped her boot. "You ever lie to me again about what you can do," he said, "lie bigger. I almost believed you were just our radio." She offered him the barest shrug. "I never said just," people added it. He nodded, eyes shifting to the rifle in an admission he wasn't too proud to make. "Who taught you?" The question arrived like a gust from long ago. The fence post and the dime, the river and the leaves, the rasp in a voice that smelled like pipe smoke and gun oil. Not many shots, only the ones that matter. She swallowed past dust and something softer. "Family," she said. "Then tell your family they've got one of ours walking out today because of them," he said, and crawled away to count heads and inventory miracles. She stayed prone for another full minute, glass on rock and ridge, because vanity kills and so does speed. She found no movement worth a bullet. She found no glint that demanded an answer. When she finally rolled to her side, the radio pressed a mark into her collarbone that she would discover later and touch with 2 fingers, the way people touch bruises to learn what story they tell. "Sierra Actual," she said into the net, voice level now. "Ridge is cold. Copy cold. Consolidate, resupply, prepare egress," came the reply. Calm, professional, grateful without saying so. She broke the rifle down with the same care she would have used to fold a flag and slid it back into foam. It felt wrong to call it a toy now. It felt like an old friend finally asked to speak. Around her, men stood, stretched, muttered, checked magazines, counted canteens, rediscovered the way their legs worked under them. Someone clapped her shoulder without words. Someone else didn't look at her, and somehow still changed the way he looked at her. As they formed a staggered file to move out of the wash, the sun burned the last of the smoke to nothing. The valley looked exactly as it had looked an hour before, and nothing like it at all. She adjusted the radio strap across her chest and fell into place. The squad leader spoke without turning. "When we get back, we're going to have a conversation about what you are." She thought of the label that had followed her from briefing room to ruck line to this cut in the earth. She thought of the word just and all the weights people hid inside it. The wind tugged at the scarf around her neck. Somewhere a hawk rode a thermal and didn't flap once. "Copy," she said, because old habits are hard and the net still needed its rituals. But inside the part of herself that had been steady on glass while the world shook, another sentence had already formed and settled. The voice that would say it had the strength of an oath and the calm of someone who no longer asked permission to exist. Not many shots, only the ones that matter. Her grandfather had said in the pasture where shadows were soft and the world was simple. She hadn't understood then. She did now, under a sun that turned rock to blade. The shots that mattered weren't always fired. Sometimes they were words, sometimes they were choices. The file moved, boots chewing fresh prints into the wash. She tracked the horizon one more time and found nothing but road. The first step she took out of the kill zone felt like the first step out of a room where the truth had been spoken. She knew what came next. The questions, the suspicion, the quiet grudges of men who would need to redraw the outlines they'd sketched of her. She also knew a different set of questions waited, older and sharper, the whispers that had lived at the edge of family stories, the one name that always came up in the same breath as betrayal, the old photograph with a face ringed in ink, the coordinates no one had explained, etched faintly into tarnished metal. She lifted a hand to the dog tag under her shirt and felt the scratch where it had caught on the mirror edge of a rock. When she pressed the metal flat against her skin, She could almost hear his voice under the rasp of rotor wash growing in the distance. "You see the wind, not the leaves," he used to say. "You read the world, not the noise it makes." The helicopters bled sound into the valley, washing it clean. She let the blade noise fill her until there was room for nothing else. When it receded, what remained was a single clear thought shaped like a target. There were people in uniform who wanted her to be small so they could feel large. There were others in positions she couldn't see who had built careers on lies. There was a man whose name had floated up from her grandfather's past like oil through water. There was proof waiting somewhere inside a life that wasn't finished speaking. The platoon reached the LZ and crouched in a crescent while dust spun itself into columns. She climbed aboard last, sat on the cold edge of the ramp with her legs dangling, headset hissing in her ear. Across from her, a young operator stared and then reached for the only words he had. "You saved us," he said, voice made small by engines. She shook her head once. "No," she said. "I bought us 9 minutes." He frowned, like that math offended him. She didn't explain. He would learn, if he lasted, that the difference between 9 minutes and forever is where most lives are won. The bird lifted, the valley shrank, the wash drew itself into a single pale line that looked harmless from above. The ridge where the machine gun had lived folded into the greater story of stone. She watched until the land became map, then closed her eyes and saw a river instead of a desert, seen from a childhood bent on learning. Leaves glittered where the breeze changed, a dime balanced on a fence post because a hand set it there and asked her to earn the right to knock it off. When the helicopter banked toward home, she opened her eyes to the sun flashing off the crew chief's visor and thought, finally, the sentence she had wanted to say on the net. The one she would say to anyone who asked her to reduce herself so their expectations would fit. "I've got eyes." She would need them. Because the next thing waiting for her wasn't applause. It was a name and a map and a city where heat rose off asphalt instead of stone. It was a bank vault whispering in steel. It was the quiet scratch on an old dog tag that felt suspiciously like coordinates. It was a past she hadn't lived, and a future already turning in her direction. She tightened the strap of the radio against her shoulder and held the weight the way you hold a promise. The rotors hammered, the world blurred, and she let the valley fall away behind her without regret. There was nothing down there that she'd failed to do. There was, up ahead, everything that mattered. The helicopter blades still echoed in Olivia's ears long after they had left the valley behind. Dust clung to her skin and sweat ran down her back, but her mind was already elsewhere, circling around the weight of an old memory. She had steadied a rifle in her hands before, not in the desert, but in a very different place, under a sky that smelled of pine instead of powder. The Sierra Nevada had been her first classroom, a wilderness where her grandfather Arthur Voss had shaped her into someone who saw more than most, someone who understood patience and consequence. She remembered being 13, standing ankle-deep in cold water where a stream cut through granite. Arthur's voice had carried over the rush of the current, calm and exact. He did not raise his tone, yet every word struck as if carved into the air. "Do not chase the leaves," he told her. "Read the wind that moves them." He had pressed an old rifle into her shoulder, a weapon older than both of them, heavy with stories, polished by his hands. She had felt the grain of the wood, the cool of the metal, and the steadying grip of his hand on her elbow. Arthur was more than a teacher. He was the echo of a generation that had walked in shadows during the Cold War. He had lived with knowledge no medal could display. His reputation had been tarnished by rumors, whispered accusations that never matched the man Olivia knew. He had carried scars that did not come from battle but from betrayal. That betrayal had a name, one that had drifted into Olivia's life like smoke seeping through cracks. Justin Hale. When Arthur spoke of him, his jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, and his words came slowly, weighted with memory. Hale had once worn the same uniform, commanded respect, and then, in Berlin, he had turned those strengths into treachery. Arthur had been cast aside, marked as the scapegoat while Hale climbed higher. Olivia had pieced together fragments of this history by listening from behind doors, catching stray conversations when Arthur thought she was asleep. At night in the cabin, she had lain awake staring at the rafters, repeating the names she heard whispered, trying to understand how loyalty could collapse into deceit. When the fire crackled low, Arthur sometimes sat in silence, pipe smoke curling around him like fog, and muttered phrases as if speaking to ghosts. One day he would say, "Truth finds its target." Olivia grew up with that mantra lodged inside her, unshakable and persistent. He trained her in ways that seemed like games but were more than that. She learned to throw a pebble and count the ripples before they touched the shore. She practiced holding her breath until the world stilled, then releasing it slowly as if her heartbeat itself could bend the moment. He tested her under rain, under snow, under the sun at its harshest. He never called her a sniper, never spoke of war. He only said, "You must be precise when it matters. One wrong move at the wrong time and you cannot take it back." The rifle she had held in Afghanistan had been a tool, but the discipline behind it came from those early mornings in the Sierra Nevada where frost coated the meadow grass and silence taught her more than any manual. She could still hear the metallic click of the bolt as Arthur demonstrated, could still see the way his hands never trembled. Her father had not understood why Arthur pushed her so hard. He called it unnecessary, even cruel. He wanted Olivia to have a quieter life, away from echoes of espionage and battlefields. But Arthur believed that the past would return, and someone needed to be ready. Olivia had resisted at first, but over time she realized he was not just teaching her to aim, he was teaching her to endure. One afternoon, long before the desert, Arthur had pulled out a small box lined with velvet. Inside lay a dog tag, worn and scratched, edges dulled by years. He placed it in her hand without explanation. "This holds more than an identity," he said. She turned it over, tracing the numbers engraved there, noticing how some digits seemed faint, others deeper, as though carved twice. He never explained fully, only said, "Remember these. Someday they may guide you." She tucked it away, uncertain, yet the cold touch of the metal lingered in her mind. Even then, she sensed it carried a secret, something beyond its simple form. As she sat now on the transport, the roar of engines fading, she thought again of those numbers. She thought of Hale's shadow stretching across decades, covering her grandfather's honor with lies. She thought of how quickly the platoon had dismissed her that morning, only to rely on her when their lives hung by a thread. Patterns repeated themselves. She had seen enough to know chance was rarely just chance. Olivia understood that her survival on that ridge was only a beginning. She had revealed a skill few expected, and with it came exposure. Questions would be asked. Why could the radio girl steady a rifle better than men who had trained for years, who had taught her? What else was she hiding? She could already imagine Hale's expression if word reached him. The man who had buried Arthur's reputation would recognize the bloodline instantly. He would not sit idle, he would act. He always had. The helicopter touched down at the forward base and dust swirled around the ramp. Men filed out, tired, some still limping but alive. She followed, her eyes scanning not the ground but the horizon, as Arthur had taught. She knew what came next was not rest, it was revelation. Somewhere in the Sierra Nevada, the past still waited, etched in steel and whispered in smoke, calling her back to where it all began. As the squad dispersed, the squad leader glanced at her once more. There was no smirk this time, no dismissive comment. His look carried a different weight, recognition, unease, respect, tangled together. He did not speak, he did not need to. She read the silence. She had always read the silence. Olivia pressed her palm against her chest where the dog tag rested beneath her uniform. Its edges marked her skin faintly, a reminder that the story was not finished. The echoes of Arthur's lessons filled her again, louder than the engines, louder than the desert wind. She had stepped into the valley as the overlooked operator with a handset. She walked out as something far more dangerous, carrying not only skill but a legacy, and with it the certainty that Hale's betrayal would not remain hidden forever. The past was stirring, and Olivia knew she would have to follow it back to its source, even if that path led her into the same shadows that had consumed her grandfather. The Sierra Nevada was waiting, and so was the truth. At Camp Falcon, the air was thick with dust and the smell of oil from the motor pool. Olivia stood among a line of recruits under the hard Texas sun, sweat sliding down her temples as the instructor barked orders. She had been accepted into sniper school by merit, yet every glance from the men beside her carried the same doubt she had felt since the valley. They saw her radio skills as her only value. They laughed at the idea she could match them with a rifle. The range became her battlefield. Targets stood silent at staggering distances, silhouettes against the haze. One after another, the trainees shouldered their weapons, most scattering their shots. When Olivia's turn came, she adjusted the stock, breathed slowly, and let her body recall Sierra Nevada mornings. Each shot cracked through the air, each one finding steel. The clanging echoed back, undeniable proof. For a moment there was silence, then murmurs rippled through the line. That silence broke when Colonel Justin Hale appeared, tall and commanding, his uniform crisp as if the dust itself respected him. His gaze cut across the recruits until it landed on Olivia. A faint smile curled on his lips. Not admiration, but something colder, a recognition laced with old history. He announced with calculated ease that some candidates were better suited for other roles. Then, without ceremony, he reassigned Olivia away from the precision track. "Your talents are needed in communications," he said, words that drew smirks from the men who had mocked her. Anger burned hot in her chest, but Arthur's lessons pressed against her thoughts. Patience, timing, one shot when it matters. She swallowed her protest and nodded, though the decision felt like shackles. Hale lingered a moment longer, eyes narrowed, as if daring her to reveal what she carried inside. Later that evening, as the sun dipped and the camp quieted, Olivia sat alone by the bleachers, rifle parts spread on a cloth. She replayed every word, every calculated move from Hale. He knew her name before reading the roster. He knew what bloodline she carried. The realization chilled her more than the night air. A shadow fell across the bench. Major Tom Cade lowered himself beside her, movements deliberate, a man who had spent years carrying secrets. He had served with Arthur, and though the details remained hidden, Olivia could see the recognition in his eyes. "You handle a weapon like someone trained long before this place," he said. She stayed silent, not sure how much to trust. Cade leaned forward, voice low. "Hale won't let you rise. He buried your grandfather and he'll bury you if you let him. But you don't have to stand alone." His words were a lifeline, quiet but firm. Captain Ryan Mercer joined them soon after, a younger officer but sharp, one who had already heard whispers of what Olivia had done in Afghanistan. Between the three of them a pact formed, unspoken at first. Training would continue, not under the official program, but in the stolen hours when others slept. Cade and Mercer would push her further, sharpen what Arthur had begun. As the camp lights flickered against the darkening sky, Olivia tightened the last screw on her weapon and met their eyes. She felt the weight of Hale's shadow pressing closer. Yet for the first time since the valley, she also felt the strength of allies at her side. The war for truth was only beginning, and Camp Falcon was no longer just a base. It was the ground where her legacy would be tested, where every secret Hale tried to bury would claw its way back into the light. The nights at Camp Falcon were short and restless. Olivia carried herself through the drills by day, radio in hand, pretending to belong in the slot Hale had forced upon her. Yet in the quiet hours after taps, she slipped away with Tom Cade and Captain Mercer. They met behind the motor sheds or along the edges of the dry creek bed where floodlights failed to reach. Tom showed her adjustments to windage, how to judge mirage in shifting heat, and how to anchor herself so recoil became a whisper instead of a shout. Mercer drilled her in tactics, in moving unseen, in how to read the rhythm of men guarding what they feared most. These secret sessions became her true classroom, the place where Arthur's teachings fused with practical soldiering. Each night she went to sleep more certain of herself and more aware that Hale's eyes were everywhere. Hale was a man who thrived on control. He made surprise inspections, lingered at the ranges, and often stood behind Olivia when she shouldered even the simplest rifle. He never accused her directly, but his smirk told her he remembered Berlin and the stain he had painted across her family's name. Every look reminded her of the dog tag Arthur had pressed into her hand years before, and of the suspicion that Hale knew she carried a piece of his undoing. One evening, Tom called her to the small supply shack he managed to keep locked from curious eyes. There, on a rack above dusty crates, lay a relic, Arthur's old M1 Garand. The stock bore tiny scratches, the kind left not by accidents, but by design. "Your grandfather trusted this more than anything," Tom said, sliding it down into her arms. The weight was heavier than she expected, not because of the steel, but because of the history lodged inside it. She brushed her thumb over the worn grain and felt a ridge she hadn't noticed before, faint, almost invisible, as though the wood concealed something more. Tom explained what Arthur had whispered before his death. That proof of Hale's treachery had been hidden where only blood could find it, a microfilm, fragile and small, sealed inside the rifle itself. That revelation lit a fire inside Olivia, yet with it came danger. Hale's network stretched further than she had realized. Within days, word reached her that operatives loyal to him were combing through Arthur's old properties. If they reached the Sierra Nevada cabin first, the evidence would be gone forever. She made her choice in silence. Under cover of a weekend pass, Olivia drove west across endless highways until the mountains rose again, their peaks wrapped in snow. Returning to that cabin was like stepping into a preserved memory. Dust lay thick on the mantel, the scent of cedar lingered in the beams, and the chair where Arthur had once smoked still faced the cold hearth. She walked to the hidden gun cabinet, opened it with trembling hands, and lifted the Garand she remembered polishing as a girl. Her fingers traced the same ridge Tom had pointed out. She used a small blade to work the edge of the stock, careful not to split the wood. A sliver came loose, revealing a hollow. Inside was a sealed capsule, no larger than her thumb. She twisted it open, and a tightly rolled strip of microfilm slipped into her palm. She knew instantly what it was: Arthur's safeguard, the evidence that Hale had betrayed his country. The creak of the front porch cut through the silence. Olivia froze. The floorboards groaned again. Through the cabin window she saw figures moving, shadows heavy with purpose. Hale had not underestimated her. He had followed. The door burst inward and armed men swept inside. Olivia darted toward the back, clutching the microfilm, heart racing. Bullets chewed into the wood as she dove behind the old iron stove. Her hand found the Garand's bolt. She chambered around, the sound echoing like thunder in the small cabin. 2 men rushed her, and she squeezed off a shot. The recoil jolted her, but the round tore through the frame, dropping one and forcing the other to dive for cover. She sprinted out the back into the cold night air, snow crunching under her boots. Headlights flared beyond the trees, engines roared. Hale's men circled like hounds. Olivia ducked into the pines, breath frosting in the dark. She fired again, the report cracking through the woods, scattering them momentarily. Yet the chase pressed on. When she stumbled into a clearing, her lungs burning, she thought she was finished. Then headlights cut through the trees from another direction. A truck slid to a halt, and Tom Cade leaned out the window, rifle already in hand. Mercer jumped from the passenger side, covering her retreat. Their arrival was a miracle Arthur himself might have orchestrated. Together they fought back through the tree line, disciplined bursts driving Hale's men into retreat. When silence fell, Hale himself stepped into view at the far edge of the clearing. He held a pistol loosely, his other arm bleeding, crimson soaking into his sleeve. His eyes locked on Olivia, sharp and furious. "You should have stayed small," he called, voice low but carrying. "Now you're carrying a weight you don't understand." Before Mercer could close the distance, Hale melted back into the dark, leaving only the echo of his words. Olivia collapsed into the truck's seat, clutching the capsule tight. She unrolled the microfilm under the dim dome light. Faded images appeared, documents, coded transmissions, even photographs. In one, Arthur stood beside Hale, and the smirk on Hale's younger face told a story more damning than any words. Here was proof, tangible and undeniable. They drove through the night toward Arizona, every mile heavy with tension. The film had to be secured, and Arthur had once spoken of a vault in Phoenix where his most important possessions rested. At dawn they reached the city, its skyline rising out of the desert haze. Inside Phoenix Trust Bank, Olivia signed in under Arthur's name. The vault door swung open, revealing a safety deposit box untouched for years. She slid the key into the lock and lifted the lid. Inside lay Arthur's diary, leather cracked with age, along with a USB drive wrapped in cloth and a photograph of the Berlin unit. In the picture, faces were circled, one in particular marked with a black ring just in Hale. As she stared, a voice behind her broke the stillness. "I wondered how long it would take you." She spun. Hale stood at the threshold, flanked by 2 men in civilian suits, their hands on concealed weapons. He looked older now, pale from his wound, but his presence was still commanding. The bank staff had scattered under his orders. The marble floor echoed with the confrontation history had built toward. Olivia slipped the diary into her bag, fingers brushing the cold steel of her sidearm. Hale stepped closer, eyes gleaming. "Your grandfather thought he could outlast me. He was wrong. You will be too." She didn't flinch. She met his gaze and let her voice steady. "Checkmate." The words sliced the air. Hale stiffened, recognition flashing. Around them the city bustled outside, unaware that within these walls 2 generations of war had converged. Olivia knew this was only the beginning. Hale would not fall easily, but she now held the truth her grandfather had died protecting, and with Tom and Mercer at her side, she would carry it forward no matter the cost. Admiral Thomas Breyer sat in a steel-walled conference room, the air inside thick with stale coffee and the scratch of pens on paper. Olivia stood before him, her uniform dusty from travel, the diary and microfilm spread across the table like relics exhumed from another lifetime. Tom Cade and Captain Mercer flanked her, silent witnesses to what she had carried out of the Sierra Nevada and Phoenix. Briar's eyes scanned the documents, lingering over the photographs that showed a younger Justin Hale in Berlin, caught in frames he had tried to erase. The Admiral's face did not change often, but as he lifted one strip of microfilm against the lamp, a flicker crossed his features. It was the recognition of rot within the institution he had sworn to protect. He set the evidence down with deliberate care. This is not rumor. This is not speculation. These are the fingerprints of betrayal, he said. His voice carried weight, the kind that filled every corner of the room. Then his gaze fell to Olivia. Your grandfather was right. He was punished for telling the truth, and now it falls to you to finish what he began. Olivia swallowed, the ache of vindication sharp and bitter. She had imagined this moment countless times, yet it was heavier than she expected. Arthur's name would finally be cleared, but the price of truth was only beginning to reveal itself. Briar signed an order in neat strokes and passed it to his aide. Hale would be officially hunted, stripped of protection. As the Admiral dismissed the others, he motioned for Olivia to stay. When the door clicked shut, silence stretched between them. Briar leaned forward, his eyes grey and unflinching. You've shown a skill set most here never suspected. The Valley made that clear. But skill is not enough. Hale has lived in the shadows for decades. He has friends in corners you cannot imagine. Olivia met his stare. Then I'll stay in the light. He can't hide there forever. Briar allowed the faintest smile, though it held no humor. Light exposes, but it also blinds. Remember that. He slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was Arthur's dog tag, returned from archives after years of neglect. Olivia's breath caught. She had not seen it since the day her grandfather pressed it into her palm, whispering that it held more than a name. Her thumb traced the worn edges, the engraved numbers, familiar yet strange. She tilted it under the light and noticed something she had missed as a girl. Tiny scratches that did not align with the rest. Faint coordinates etched by a hand that knew someone would one day look closer. They were too deliberate to be wear, too precise to be chance. She looked up sharply. This wasn't in the file? Briar shook his head. We catalogued it as personal property. The scratches weren't noted. I doubt anyone cared enough to see them. Tom leaned in, reading the digits over her shoulder. Coordinates, he murmured. Arthur marked a second location. A chill ran through Olivia. The microfilm had been damning, but if Arthur had hidden more, then the game was far from finished. She closed her fist around the tag, feeling the cold metal bite her skin. He left us a trail, she said quietly. Mercer straightened, tension in his jaw. If Hale realizes you've got this, he'll burn everything to the ground before letting you reach it. The Admiral nodded slowly. Then you move quickly. We'll give you resources, but discretion is key. Hale still has sympathizers. If word spreads, you won't reach those coordinates alive. When they left the base that evening, the sky was streaked with fading red, the kind of twilight that blurred between hope and warning. Olivia rode in silence beside Tom and Mercer, the tag heavy in her pocket. She replayed every memory of Arthur, searching for hints she had missed. She remembered nights by the fire when he muttered to himself, nights when his hand lingered on that piece of metal, as if it were both shield and map. They stopped at a roadside diner, the kind with neon that buzzed and coffee that tasted of burnt grounds. Olivia spread the dog tag on the table, scribbling the numbers into a notebook. She aligned them against a map, drawing lines, checking latitudes. The coordinates pointed toward Missouri, deep into the Ozark Hills. The forests there were vast, riddled with caves and old strongholds, a place Hale could twist into a fortress. Tom watched her work, his expression heavy. Arthur must have known the microfilm wasn't enough. He hid something more. Names, accounts, maybe even orders. If we find it, Hale can't hide behind excuses. Olivia closed the notebook. Then that's where we go. For a moment they sat in silence, the hum of the neon above them the only sound. Olivia looked at their reflections in the window, hers tense, Tom's weary, Mercer's sharp and restless. They were a team stitched together by circumstance, but bound now by the legacy of a man who had refused to let truth die. Outside, trucks rolled past on the highway, headlights cutting through the dusk. Olivia touched the dog tag again, hearing Arthur's voice in her memory. Not many shots, only the ones that matter. This was one of them. The valley had been survival, but this would be legacy. She stepped out into the cool night, the air thick with the smell of asphalt and rain. Above the horizon, the first stars flickered into view. She wondered if Arthur had chosen those coordinates not just for what they contained, but for the reminder that darkness could still be pierced. They would head to the Ozarks. Hale would expect them, perhaps even wait for them. But Olivia was no longer the girl with a radio. She carried truth in her pocket, skill in her hands, and a vow burning in her chest. Her grandfather had been silenced once. She would not let it happen again. As the three of them climbed back into the truck, Mercer started the engine and glanced at her. "You ready for this?" Olivia stared out at the open road stretching east. "I don't think ready is the right word," she said. Her grip tightened on the tag. "But I know it matters, and that's enough." The truck pulled away, tail lights vanishing into the dark. Behind them the diner's neon hummed, a small glow in the vast night. Ahead lay the Ozark Hills, and in them the final secrets Hale had buried. Olivia's heart pounded steady, not with fear, but with the certainty of someone who had found her target and would not stop until it was struck. The Ozark Hills rose like dark waves against the horizon, their ridgelines covered in thick forest that swallowed roads and silenced engines. Olivia sat in the back of the truck with her rifle laid across her knees, eyes fixed on the tree line. Each turn in the narrow road pressed the shadows closer. Tom Cade drove with steady hands, every mile measured, while Mercer checked their map against Arthur's coordinates. The numbers carved into the dog tag had led them here, to a stretch of wilderness that locals spoke of with unease. They stopped at the edge of an abandoned service road. The forest pressed in heavy and damp, the air filled with the smell of moss and old stone. Tom cut the engine and spoke quietly, as if sound itself might draw attention. Arthur knew these hills. He used to talk about them during training runs. If he hid something, this is the ground he would have chosen. Olivia stepped out, boots sinking into soft earth. She scanned the trees, noting the unnatural silence. No birds, no wind, only the faint buzz of insects. Hale had turned this wilderness into a stronghold. She could feel it in the way the air seemed to wait. They moved on foot, rifles low, eyes searching every ridge. The path narrowed into a ravine, the stone walls scarred by recent blasting. Mercer crouched, brushing his fingers over broken rock. This wasn't natural. Someone dug here. He pointed to the ridge above. Faint outlines of a watchtower peeked through the foliage. Hale had built his fortress over Arthur's secret. As they advanced, Olivia's memory pulled her back to Sierra Nevada mornings, Arthur standing over her shoulder, teaching her how to see patterns others missed. The same discipline guided her now. She noticed the way brush had been trimmed in straight lines, the faint metallic glint of tripwire strung across a log. She halted the team with a raised hand. Mercer followed her gaze, then carefully cut the wire. "He wants us to walk blind," Mercer muttered. They reached the entrance of an old mine shaft reinforced with steel beams. The coordinates matched. This was the place Arthur had marked. Olivia's pulse quickened. Inside these tunnels lay the truth her grandfather had carried to his grave. Tom studied the entrance, frowning. "Hale's already here. Look at the fresh tracks, heavy equipment, multiple boots." Olivia tightened her grip on her rifle. She had expected this. Hale knew her too well to underestimate her pursuit. He would be waiting inside, guarding what he feared most. The air grew colder as they descended into the mine. Their flashlights cut narrow beams across damp rock and rusted rails. Graffiti from decades ago lined the walls, but fresh marks, chalk arrows, boot scuffs showed recent passage. Every step echoed. Olivia's heart pounded with each hollow sound, reminding her that any corner could open into an ambush. Deeper inside, they found the remnants of a camp. Empty crates, fuel cans, the smell of burnt rations. Maps pinned to the wall showed supply routes, coded notes scribbled in Hale's hand. He had been here for weeks, digging, searching. Then they heard it. A low rumble, the clank of machinery. They pressed forward until the tunnel widened into a chamber lit by work lamps. At the far end, Hale's men dug furiously into the rock, hauling out crates sealed with army markings. And there, standing above them, was Hale himself, his arm still bandaged from the cabin fight, his presence commanding even in the underground gloom. Olivia froze in the shadows, watching him. He looked older than she remembered, but his voice carried the same venom. "Arthur thought he could hide it from me, but I've taken back what he stole, every name, every contact, every account. With this, I'll never be touched." Her chest tightened. He had found the second cache. Arthur's last safeguard was now in Hale's hands. Mercer's eyes flicked to her, silently asking if she would take the shot. She raised the rifle, reticle settling on Hale's chest. One squeeze and it would end. The weight of Arthur's mantra pressed into her mind. Not many shots, only the ones that matter. But Arthur's words were more than about precision. They were about purpose. Killing Hale now might silence him, but it would also bury the proof with his body. She hesitated, finger tense on the trigger, until her decision hardened. She would not waste a bullet when the world needed a witness. Olivia lowered the rifle. Tom's eyes widened, but he understood. Mercer nodded once, his jaw set. They would have to strike another way. Hale turned suddenly, scanning the tunnel as though sensing her presence. His eyes narrowed into the darkness. For a moment, Olivia thought he saw her, thought his smirk meant recognition. Then he raised a detonator in his hand and addressed his men. "If they come for me, we bury them all." The chamber fell silent. Olivia's heart hammered. Hale was willing to bring the mountain down rather than face exposure. She whispered to Tom and Mercer, "This isn't about taking him out here. It's about pulling the truth into daylight. We get what he's holding, or none of this matters." They melted back into the shadows, the plan forming between breaths. The fight for Arthur's legacy was no longer about survival. It was about dragging Hale out of his fortress and into a place where his lies could finally collapse around him. As they retreated through the tunnels, Olivia touched the dog tag in her pocket. The coordinates had brought her here, but Arthur's true gift was the reminder of patience. The moment to strike would come, and when it did, she would not hesitate. For now, the Ozark Hills kept their secret, but not for long. Hale's fortress was strong, yet even stone could crack when truth pressed against it. The Ozark night pressed heavy against the hills, though Olivia barely noticed the darkness. Her focus was locked on the narrow trail leading back toward the mine, the path Hale's men had carved into the earth. Each step forward brought a louder hum of generators and the metallic clang of machinery echoing through stone. The cache Arthur had hidden was inside, and now Hale controlled it. She could almost feel his arrogance vibrating from the walls. Tom crouched beside her at the edge of a ridge, eyes narrowing as he studied the guards below. 4 men circled the mine entrance, rifles slung across their chests, movements crisp, rehearsed. Mercer whispered, "They've fortified the place. Too many to take in a straight fight." Olivia adjusted the strap of her rifle, gaze fixed on the watchtower Hale had built above the shaft. Floodlights swept across the clearing in slow arcs, cutting through the fog rolling off the hills. The whole stronghold looked less like a mine and more like a fortress. She could imagine Hale inside, clutching that detonator, believing he could bring everything down in fire before letting the truth escape. The memory of her grandfather's voice pressed into her mind. Aim for what matters most. Not destruction, not vengeance, but truth. That thought steadied her. "We go through the old tunnel," she whispered, "the one cut off near the ridge. If Arthur knew this ground, he left us more than coordinates. He left us a way in." Tom nodded. He had fought beside Arthur once, and he trusted the man's foresight. Mercer checked his map, then jabbed a finger toward a shadowed ravine. "There. The collapse looks natural, but it's not. If we clear it, we can slip inside without being seen." They moved under the cover of mist, their steps muffled by damp earth. Olivia led the way, every sense stretched thin. She traced the terrain as Arthur had taught her, reading the angles of stone, the unnatural lines where men had carved into the hillside decades ago. The tunnel entrance was half buried under boulders, but the faint imprint of old timber still framed the rock. Together they pried loose enough space to crawl through. Inside, the air was damp and sharp with the tang of iron. Their flashlights cut thin beams along jagged stone. The tunnel sloped downward, each step echoing with history. Olivia brushed her hand against the walls, imagining Arthur passing this same way, carving secrets into earth to protect them from betrayal. The deeper they moved, the louder the hum of machinery grew. Soon they reached a narrow ledge that overlooked the main chamber. Below, work lamps bathed the cavern in harsh white. Hale stood at the center, his bandaged arm stiff at his side, his voice commanding as he barked orders to his men. Crates lay stacked around him, each marked with faded army insignia. Documents spilled across a steel table, lists, codes, maps. Arthur's second cache, the real treasure Hale had hunted for half his life. Olivia steadied her breath, watching Hale clutch the detonator. He tapped it against his thigh as if daring fate to test him. His voice carried through the cavern. "This is the insurance policy. The world may think me disgraced, but with these names, these accounts, I own them all. If anyone tries to drag me down, I'll bury every last one of them in this mountain." Tom shifted beside her, his expression grim. "One shot, Liv. We end him here." Her crosshairs hovered over Hale's chest. Her finger brushed the trigger steady as stone. One squeeze and decades of treachery would vanish into silence. Yet Arthur's words stopped her. If she killed Hale now, the truth might die with him. The documents would be dismissed as forgeries, the names lost in smoke. Justice required exposure, not a corpse. Olivia lowered the rifle. No, not yet. Mercer's jaw tightened, but he understood. Then we need the cash. If we get it out, Hale has nothing left to bargain with. Below, one of Hale's men dragged a crate too close to the lamplight. Olivia saw it crack open, revealing folders wrapped in oilskin, stamped with seals long buried in classified archives. The sheer volume made her chest tighten. Arthur hadn't just hidden proof of Hale's betrayal. He had hidden an entire network. A sudden clang echoed through the chamber. One of the guards had spotted movement near the tunnel's lower entrance. Their lights swept upward, beams searching the ledges. Olivia pressed herself against the stone, heartbeat thrumming. Hale raised his head, eyes narrowing toward the shadows. "Find them!" he snapped, lifting the detonator high. His men fanned out, weapons ready. The cavern turned tense, every sound amplified. Olivia gestured to Tom and Mercer, signaling retreat. They crawled back into the tunnel, every scrape of boot against rock a gamble. Behind them, voices barked orders, boots pounded against stone. The chase had begun. They reached a fork in the tunnel and split the lamps, leaving one flickering against the far passage to draw pursuit. Olivia led them down the narrower route, her hand brushing the dog tag in her pocket. The engraved numbers burned in her mind, as though Arthur himself guided her. When they finally emerged into the cool night, the forest seemed to exhale. But the reprieve was short. Hale's voice echoed faintly from the shaft carried by the wind. "You can't run forever. I'll collapse this hill and take you with it." Olivia turned to Tom and Mercer, her eyes sharp in the moonlight. "He thinks he can end it on his terms. He's wrong. We take the proof into daylight. Then the world will see him for what he is." Mercer tightened his grip on his weapon. "And if he tries to bury us before then?" Olivia lifted the rifle, the weight of it steady in her hands. "Then we remind him some walls can't be collapsed, not when truth is stronger than stone." They moved through the forest, the distant hum of Hale's generators fading behind them, but Olivia knew this was not escape. It was a repositioning, a chance to strike where it mattered most. The detonator in Hale's hand was a threat, but the cache he had unearthed was the key to unraveling everything. As they climbed a ridge overlooking the valley, dawn's first light spilled across the horizon. Olivia paused, watching the sun pierce the mist. She thought of Arthur standing in a meadow long ago, teaching her to see the wind in the leaves. She felt his presence in that moment, as if he had walked them here, step by step, to the edge of revelation. Her voice was quiet but certain. He's not the one holding the high ground anymore. Tom and Mercer looked at her, then at the rising sun, and understood. The next move would not be Hale's. It would be hers, and when it came, it would strike like a bullet meant for only one target. The truth. The morning over the Ozarks broke with a pale fire, the kind that stretched shadows long across the hills and painted every ridge in gold. Olivia crouched on a limestone outcrop, the forest heavy with mist below her. She could hear the hum of Hale's generators drifting faint but steady, like the heartbeat of the mountain. The night's escape had bought them hours, nothing more. Hale was inside that cavern with the detonator, convinced he could burn the truth with him. Olivia steadied her rifle across her knees, the metal cool against her palms. She thought of Arthur's dog tag in her pocket, the faint scratches that had led her here. They weren't just coordinates, they were a command, a final order whispered through generations. Her grandfather had buried proof deep in the ground, but he had also left her the compass to bring it into the light. Now the choice lay heavy on her shoulders: finish Hale with a bullet, or pull him into the daylight where his empire would collapse. Tom adjusted the strap of his pack, his face worn from nights without rest. "If we hit him now, we've got surprise. But we might not walk out alive. Those crates, those names, Hale's ready to die rather than let them out." Mercer's jaw tightened as he scanned the valley through binoculars. "He'll trigger that detonator at the first sign of failure. We can't let him be the one to choose how this ends." Olivia closed her eyes for a breath, remembering Arthur's words: "Not many shots, only the ones that matter." She opened them again, gaze sharp. "Then we make him think he's in control until he isn't. We take the evidence from under his nose, and when he realizes it's gone, he'll have no ground left to stand on." They moved through the woods in silence, circling the ridge until they reached a secondary shaft the miners had abandoned decades earlier. The tunnel was narrower, damp with dripping water, but it led them closer to the chamber's heart. Olivia led the way, her flashlight beam catching flecks of quartz in the rock, each sparkle reminding her of the glint of glass on a ridgeline in Afghanistan. She pressed forward, one careful step at a time. The tunnel opened suddenly into a side gallery above the cavern. From here they saw it all, rows of crates stacked like walls, papers strewn across tables, maps pinned under rocks. Hale stood at the center, flanked by armed men, his left hand gripping the detonator with the familiarity of prayer beads. His voice carried upward, harsh and assured. "They think they can root me out, but this cache is my throne. With it I hold names of generals, ministers, men who bow in public and beg in private. If they want me gone, they'll have to erase themselves." Olivia steadied her breath. She saw the arrogance in Hale's posture, the way he held the detonator not just as a weapon but as a symbol. He was daring the world to challenge him. She turned to Tom and Mercer. "We get the evidence, then we draw him out. I won't shoot him down here. The world has to see." Mercer smirked grimly, always making things harder, but Tom nodded. Arthur would have wanted truth, not revenge. They waited for a lull, then slipped down into the shadows. Every step across the cavern floor felt like crossing open sky. Olivia's pulse thundered in her ears as she reached one of the crates, hands trembling as she pried it open. Inside lay folders stamped top secret, pages yellowed but intact. She slid them into her pack, heart hammering with each rustle of paper. Suddenly a shout rang out. A guard had caught sight of Mercer, his flashlight beam cutting across the dark. The cavern erupted in gunfire, echoes crashing like thunder. Olivia dove behind a crate, pulling her rifle close. Bullets sparked off stone. Hale's voice roared above the chaos. "Seal the exits! Bring the mountain down if you have to!" He lifted the detonator high, thumb hovering over the trigger. Olivia rose from cover, her scope locked on his face. One squeeze and it would all be over, yet the evidence in her pack would mean nothing if his men buried them in rubble. She forced herself to breathe, lowering the rifle an inch. Instead she fired at the floodlights overhead. The cavern plunged into half-darkness, confusion rippling through Hale's men. Mercer and Tom seized the moment, laying down fire that pushed the guards back. Olivia sprinted through the chaos, pack bouncing against her spine, the dog tag pressed into her chest like a second heartbeat. She reached the tunnel they had come from, shouting for Mercer and Tom. They fell back toward her, gunfire chasing their heels. Behind them Hale bellowed, fury ripping his voice raw. "You think you can steal from me? You'll never leave these hills alive!" They scrambled into the tunnel, bullets sparking off rock as they retreated. The passage shuddered with distant charges, Hale's men setting explosives to seal them in. Dust rained from the ceiling, stones cracking under stress. They ran until their lungs burned, until daylight flickered at the tunnel's end. They spilled out into the forest just as a roar ripped through the hillside. The mine behind them collapsed in a plume of smoke and fire, the ground trembling beneath their boots. For a moment silence returned. Olivia gasped for air, staring at the rising dust. Hale was still alive. She could feel it. He would not let himself be buried with the truth so close to his grasp. Hours later, as they reached a safe house on the edge of the hills, Olivia laid the documents across a table, pages scattered like a storm. Names, codes, transactions, it was all there, enough to topple Hale's network and drag him into daylight. But it also meant one thing: he would come for her with everything he had left. Night settled over the Ozarks. Olivia sat alone on the porch, the dog tag cool against her palm. She thought of Arthur standing in the Sierra Nevada, whispering lessons about wind and patience. She had chosen not to kill Hale in the dark. The world deserved to see him stripped bare, not silenced. She whispered into the night, "One more shot, Grandpa, the one that matters most." Her words proved prophetic. At dawn, Hale emerged. He had survived the collapse, limping but defiant, flanked by men who still believed in his promises. He stormed the clearing outside the safe house, voice thundering with rage. "Give me the cash, or I bring this entire forest down!" He raised the detonator again, shaking it as though it were divine judgment. Olivia stepped forward, rifle in hand at muzzle lowered. She spoke so every man in the clearing could hear. "This isn't your mountain anymore, Hale. It never was. My grandfather left this truth for a reason. And now everyone will see it." She unzipped her pack and lifted a folder high, pages fluttering in the wind. Names stared back in black ink, names Hale had sworn to protect by burying the truth. Gasps rippled among his men. Some lowered their rifles. Hale's hand trembled on the detonator. His smirk cracked into desperation. "You don't understand. Without control, they'll destroy us all." Olivia's voice steadied. "No. Without truth, you already destroyed yourself." For the first time, Hale's eyes wavered. The mountain behind him smoldered, evidence of his desperation. His men shifted, loyalty breaking under the weight of exposure. He looked at Olivia, then at the detonator in his hand. For a heartbeat, she thought he would press it, bury them all. But his shoulders sagged, his thumb lifted, the detonator clattered to the ground. Armed teams surged from the trees, Admiral Breyer's men moving in with precision. Hale's guards dropped their weapons, leaving him alone in the clearing. He stood defiant, but the fight had drained from him. Olivia approached slowly, her rifle at her side. She looked him in the eye, not with hatred, but with finality. "Checkmate," she said, the word a closing door. Hale was taken into custody, the cash secured. The network he had built for decades collapsed in days. Every secret spilled into the daylight. Arthur's name was cleared, his honor restored. Weeks later, under a bright sky at Arlington, Olivia stood before her grandfather's grave. A crowd gathered as Breyer pinned a posthumous medal to Arthur's name. Olivia stepped forward alone, drawing a single round from her pocket. She placed it gently on the stone, her voice soft but steady. "The shot that mattered wasn't the one I fired. It was the one that carried truth into the light." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of cut grass and fresh earth. She closed her eyes, hearing Arthur's voice in memory, calm and sure. Not many shots, only the ones that matter. When she opened them again, she saw the future ahead, not in shadows but in clarity. She was no longer just the radio girl, no longer a soldier defined by what others saw. She was Olivia Voss, inheritor of a legacy, bearer of truth, and the woman who had finally ended Hale's reign. As she turned away from the grave, the weight of the rifle on her shoulder felt lighter, not because it carried less responsibility, but because she finally understood. Justice was not measured by bullets alone. It was measured by what those bullets preserved: honor, truth, and the courage to face shadows in the open sun. In the end, Olivia's journey was not just about survival, but about restoring honor, carrying truth where lies once stood, and proving that one voice, one choice, can change everything. At VeteranBiker, we believe stories like hers remind us that courage is measured not by how loud we fight, but by what we fight for. Thank you for riding with us through this story. If you felt the weight of Olivia's legacy, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to VeteranBiker and stay tuned for the next story already waiting on your screen.